The words pierced through the wedding reception like an arrow shot from a bow. "How dare you show your face here?" Victoria said it quietly, but loud enough for the people standing nearby to hear. We were at the gift table. I had just placed an envelope containing a $10,000 check, my wedding gift to my son Blake and his new wife. And now, that same woman was telling me I didn't belong at my own son's wedding. I stood there in my navy suit, the one I had bought specifically for this day, the one Blake had said looked great when I showed him the photo. The reception was in full swing around us. The band was playing, guests were dancing, and under the country club's lights, everyone looked beautiful. Everyone except me. I could feel people watching me, not helping, just watching. I will never forget those eyes. Victoria's sister, Jennifer, stepped closer and took position on my other side. "This is supposed to be a happy day," she said sweetly, but her eyes were ice cold. "Family only," she emphasized it clearly. If you've ever been erased in a room full of people, you know exactly what that feels like. If you want to share your own experience in the comments, feel free. We're all here to support each other. I'll continue. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I wasn't family, not real family, not the family that mattered. Blake was across the room, laughing with his groomsmen, completely unaware that his new wife was systematically tearing apart his relationship with his father in the middle of their wedding reception. Victoria had planned this moment carefully. She waited until Blake was distracted, until I was alone, until the perfect moment to make her position unmistakably clear. I was no longer welcome in my son's life, and no one stopped her. Blake had lost his mother when he was 12. I raised my son alone. I was the one who taught him how to ride a bike, the one who stood by him through every struggle. I worked long overtime hours as a civil engineer just to put him through college. I helped him start his business. I celebrated every milestone with him for 31 years. But Victoria had been in his life for 3 years. And apparently, that was enough to decide who belonged and who didn't. Some of you know exactly what this feels like. They trust a stranger far too quickly. Standing there beside the gift table, surrounded by flowers, champagne glasses, and the sounds of celebration, I realized something. This wasn't about the wedding. It was never about just one evening. This was about the rest of my life. And this was only the beginning. The silence stretched between us while the band played "The Way You Look Tonight." No one spoke. That's when it hit me. This wasn't spontaneous. This was strategy. Victoria hadn't just decided in that moment to exclude me. She'd been working toward this for months, maybe longer. I didn't react. I filed it away. Every conversation over the past year, every time Victoria had suggested Blake and I didn't need to talk as often, every time she'd made plans for holidays that somehow didn't include me, every time she'd positioned herself between Blake and me during family gathering. What I didn't know yet was that Victoria had underestimated exactly who she was trying to erase. I'd been watching too, quietly, carefully, and I'd been preparing for longer than Victoria had been scheming. Because what Victoria didn't understand was that some fathers don't just disappear quietly. Some fathers fight back with weapons Victoria couldn't even see coming. The folder in my car contained documents Victoria didn't know existed, legal papers that would change everything she thought she knew about her new family's future. But first, I had to let Victoria finish her performance, because what Victoria was about to learn was that assumptions about powerless fathers can be very, very dangerous. Blake had called me 6 weeks before the wedding, which was unusual timing for a social call. "Dad," he'd said, his voice careful in a way that reminded me of when he was a teenager asking permission for something he knew I wouldn't like. "Victoria and I have been talking about the future." At the time, it felt harmless. "We're thinking about starting fresh after the wedding. New traditions, new way of doing things. Building our own family identity. Documents no family wants to see. Papers that showed Victoria had been researching my finances for months. She'd hired someone to look into my assets, my property, my investments, everything I'd built over 31 years of single fatherhood. Victoria hadn't been planning a wedding. She'd been planning an inheritance. Blake had no idea his future wife had spent months calculating exactly what his father was worth, or that she'd developed a detailed strategy for ensuring Blake inherited everything as quickly and completely as possible. Victoria's research had revealed that I owned significant assets, my house, retirement accounts, and life insurance policies, well over $700,000 that Victoria was very interested in controlling. And that was the moment I realized she wasn't trying to exclude me from the family. She was trying to position herself as the only family Blake would need when I was gone. "We should probably discuss some practical things," Victoria had said during what I thought was a casual lunch 3 months before the wedding. "Legal documents don't lie. People do." Victoria had brought printed pages with her. Medical power of attorney forms, financial power of attorney documents, templates she'd found online, all prepared for me to sign. "Blake and I have been thinking," she'd said, spreading the papers across the restaurant table like she was discussing dinner plans. "You're all alone now. What if something happens to you?" Blake would be devastated if there were legal complications. You could feel the script in her voice. "These documents would just make everything simpler. Blake could handle your affairs if you got sick, take care of everything for you." That's when I realized they weren't offering help. They were presenting a decision. Victoria had researched exactly what legal documents would give Blake, and by extension her, complete control over everything I owned. She'd prepared everything I would need to sign to make myself legally powerless, and she'd positioned it as Blake's idea, as a loving son's concern for his aging father's welfare. "The lawyer said we should get this done before the wedding," Victoria had pressed, pulling out a pen. That single detail changed everything. Victoria wasn't suggesting we discuss these legal arrangements someday in the future. She was expecting me to sign documents at a restaurant, witnessed by strangers, based on a conversation I hadn't known was coming. "Which lawyer?" I'd asked. Victoria's confidence faltered for just a second. "Blake's friend from college. He specializes in elder law. I'd like to speak with him directly." "Oh, that's not necessary. He prepared everything. You just need to sign." But Victoria had made a critical mistake. She'd assumed I was vulnerable. She'd built her entire strategy on the belief that fathers like me, older men, alone, dependent on their children, for emotional connection, would sign anything to maintain their relationships with their sons. Victoria was about to learn that grief doesn't make everyone helpless. Inside my jacket that day was a business card from my own attorney, the lawyer who'd helped me build my retirement portfolio, who'd structured my assets, who'd prepared documents Victoria didn't know existed, documents that would make Victoria's power of attorney papers completely worthless. Quiet people don't argue, they document. I'd been working with my attorney for 18 months, not because I suspected Victoria specifically, but because I'd learned something important about protecting yourself when you're a single parent. You plan for every possibility. Gerald had helped me create an irrevocable trust. Everything I owned, the house, the retirement accounts, the life insurance, was now protected from anyone who might try to manipulate Blake into making decisions against my interests. In every fraud, one detail cracks, then everything spills out. Victoria didn't suddenly change. She'd been consistent for 3 years. I changed. I stopped trusting. I started protecting. When Victoria had started researching my finances, she'd triggered automatic notifications my attorney had set up. When she'd hired someone to investigate my assets, we'd hired someone to investigate her. What we'd found was illuminating. Victoria had done this before. The private investigator, Gerald, had found something disturbing about Victoria's first marriage. Her ex-husband's father had signed over power of attorney shortly before Victoria filed for divorce. I stopped reading the report there, my hands shaking. There was more. The man had died 8 months after signing those documents. His assets, $120,000, had gone directly to Victoria's ex-husband, who'd split everything with Victoria as part of their divorce settlement. $120,000 from an elderly man who'd thought he was protecting his son's marriage. Victoria had a pattern. She identified older family members with assets, gained their trust, isolated them from other family members, then positioned herself to inherit their wealth when they died. But Victoria had made a critical miscalculation with me. She'd assumed I was isolated because I was alone. She'd mistaken independence for vulnerability. What Victoria didn't understand was that some men choose to remain single because they've learned to protect themselves. Some men build financial security precisely so they can't be manipulated. And some men watch very carefully when someone starts asking too many questions about their money. The rehearsal dinner had been perfect, at least on the surface. Blake looked happy. Victoria looked beautiful. All the right people said all the right things, but I'd caught Blake watching me during one of Victoria's speeches about new beginnings. Just for a moment, his expression had shifted, like he was hearing something that didn't quite sound right. I'd spent the evening watching Victoria work the room, cataloging how she introduced herself to my friends, how she positioned herself in family photos, how she managed conversations about my life and Blake's childhood. She was erasing me systematically, one interaction at a time. "Your dad must be so excited to have more time for himself," she had said to Blake while I was standing right there. "No more worrying about family obligations. Blake's looking forward to having his own family traditions," she told my brother. "Fresh start, you know?" Every conversation was designed to reinforce the same message. Blake was moving on. Victoria was his new family. I was his past. But what Victoria didn't know was that I'd spent the entire evening recording everything. Not secretly. I'd told everyone I was documenting Blake's wedding weekend for a photo album I was making. No one questioned why the father of the groom was taking so many pictures, asking people to repeat their toasts, making sure I captured every special moment, including the moments when Victoria thought I wasn't paying attention. After Victoria told me I didn't belong at my son's wedding, I excused myself to the parking lot. I walked to my car, opened the trunk, and retrieved a manila folder I'd placed there before the ceremony. Inside were documents that would end Victoria's plans permanently. When I returned to the reception, Blake was still across the room with his friends. Victoria was now standing with her parents, probably explaining how she'd handled the father situation. I walked directly to the microphone the band had been using for announcements. "Excuse me," I said, tapping the microphone. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" The music stopped. Conversations paused. Everyone turned toward me, including Blake, who looked confused, and Victoria, whose face had gone pale. "I wanted to take a moment to share something special with everyone," I said, opening the folder. "Something Blake doesn't even know about yet." Blake started walking toward me, but I held up my hand. "Victoria just told me I don't belong here. And you know what? She's absolutely right. I don't belong here, not as someone you can erase." I pulled out the first document. "I belong at the coast, in the house I just purchased, with the view of the ocean Blake loved so much when he was a child." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I also belong in the mountains, in the cabin I've been looking at. Blake always wanted to learn to ski, but we couldn't afford it when he was young." I looked directly at Victoria, whose mouth was opening and closing like she was trying to speak, but couldn't form words. "And I belong in Blake's future, as someone who can afford to pay for his children's education, their medical expenses, their opportunities." I held up the trust documents. "This is an irrevocable trust containing $875,000. Everything I've saved, everything I've earned, everything I've built over 31 years. The reception had gone completely silent. The trust names Blake as the primary beneficiary, but only if he remains unmarried or if he marries someone who signs a prenuptial agreement acknowledging that this money belongs to Blake alone. Victoria made a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. "Victoria, did you sign a prenuptial agreement?" Blake was staring at me, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been understanding. "Dad, what are you doing?" he asked quietly. "I'm protecting you," I said, "from someone who's been researching our family's assets for months, who hired a private investigator to calculate what you'd inherit when I die, who prepared power of attorney documents to control my money." I pulled out the investigator's report. "Someone who's done this before. Someone whose first father-in-law died within months of signing over financial control." Victoria was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage. "This is insane," she said. "Blake, your father is having some kind of breakdown." "Am I?" I asked. I looked at Blake. "Ask her about the elder law attorney. Ask her about the power of attorney papers. Ask her why she knows more about my finances than you do." Blake's face was changing as he processed what I was saying. "Victoria? What is he talking about?" "I was trying to help," Victoria said. "Your father is alone. We thought, we?" Blake's voice was getting harder. "Who is we?" The wedding reception ended early. Blake confronted Victoria in front of both families, demanding to see the documents she'd prepared, asking about the private investigator, questioning every conversation they'd had about me over the past year. Victoria's explanations became increasingly desperate as Blake realized the scope of what she'd been planning. The research into my assets, the legal documents she'd prepared without my knowledge, the systematic campaign to isolate me from his life. "You hired someone to investigate my father?" Blake's voice carried across the reception area. Guests had stopped pretending not to watch. Victoria's parents looked mortified. "I was protecting us," Victoria said. "Protecting our future. Your father has money, Blake, a lot of money. I wanted to make sure." Make sure what? That you could control it? Victoria's sister Jennifer stepped forward. Blake, you're being unreasonable. Victoria loves you. She was thinking about your children's future. Were you thinking about my children's future when you researched my father's life insurance policy? Blake asked. When you calculated how much he was worth? When you prepared legal documents to take control of his money? Most damaging of all, the revelation that she'd done this before. I pulled out the final document from my folder, the investigative report about Victoria's first marriage. Blake, I said quietly, there's something else you need to know. I handed him the report. Victoria's first father-in-law signed over power of attorney 8 months before he died. His assets went to Victoria's first husband, who split everything with Victoria in their divorce. Blake read the document, his face growing paler with each line. $120,000, I continued, from a man who thought he was protecting his son's marriage, a man who died alone, isolated from other family members, confused about his own financial affairs. Blake looked at Victoria with an expression I'd never seen before. Is this true? Victoria was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage mixed with desperation. That was different, she said. Robert was sick. He needed help. You didn't what? Take advantage of him? The same way you were planning to take advantage of my father? Blake called off the marriage that night. Not just the reception, the marriage itself. In front of 200 guests, he told Victoria he couldn't spend his life with someone who saw his family as a financial opportunity. Justice doesn't shout. It lets time do the talking. I used the money from the trust to help Blake start over. We went to therapy together to rebuild our relationship after Victoria's manipulation. We talked about how she'd gradually convinced him that my involvement in his life was unhealthy, how she'd positioned herself as his only necessary family. The therapy sessions were difficult. Blake had to confront how Victoria had manipulated his perception of our relationship. She'd convinced him that my phone calls were intrusive, my visits too frequent, my interest in his life unhealthy rather than paternal love. She made me feel guilty for loving you, Blake told me during one session. Every time I wanted to include you, she'd make me feel like I was choosing you over her. Blake learned about love versus control, about partners who isolate you from people who care, about building a new life without abandoning your old one. Victoria contested the trust documents, claiming I'd manipulated Blake's marriage decisions. Gerald had anticipated this. The trust was established 18 months before their engagement as comprehensive estate planning, not a reaction to Victoria. 6 months later, Blake met Sarah, a teacher who encouraged his relationship with me, who invited me to family dinners, who understood that loving someone means loving their history. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony where I gave a toast about family, about belonging, about love that includes rather than excludes. Victoria moved to another state. I heard through mutual friends that she'd gotten engaged again to a man whose elderly father had recently been diagnosed with dementia. Some people never learn. Some people can only be stopped. Help is offered. Control's taken. Some of us are older, yes, but we're not blind. We can recognize manipulation disguised as concern. We can tell the difference between people who want to join our families and people who want to replace our families. If you've ever been talked about, like you weren't there, you already know why this story matters. And when someone stands at your child's wedding and tries to erase you from their life with quiet cruelty and manufactured authority, we can remind them of something very important. Never underestimate a father who's had 31 years to learn how to protect what matters most. Victoria found out that assumptions about powerless elderly men can be very expensive. Some fathers don't disappear quietly when their children get married. Some fathers fight back with lawyers, with documentation, with the kind of financial security that takes decades to build. And some fathers remember that real family includes everyone who's earned their place at the table, not just the people, who want to clear away the existing place settings, my son's future, my family's integrity, my responsibility to protect Blake from people who see love as a transaction. Victoria learned that wedding receptions end, but family endures. That manipulation works until it doesn't. That fathers like me don't just fade away because someone decides we're inconvenient. Family isn't about who has the newest claim or the loudest voice. Family is about who stays loyal when staying costs something, who builds bridges instead of burning them. Who understands that love multiplies when shared, rather than diminishes when divided? And when experience is cornered by someone who mistakes kindness for weakness, we don't argue, we don't plead, we don't beg for a place we've already earned. We document, we prepare, we protect. So ask yourself, what would you have done?